So yeah, my name's Billee McGinley. I'm just representing myself. I'll acknowledge firstly that we meet on Larrakia land and to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and pay my respects to all the elders past and present of lands we're speaking of today. Last time we met in much more casual circumstances at Humpty Doo Community Forum on a Friday afternoon, and there was only a couple of us that turned up, so we got to sit around and have a bit more of a casual conversation, which was nice. Got this great slide up here, and sort of pulling on what Naomi was just saying from what we get to is we can't really trust these oil and gas companies. Last time I introduced myself in detail. I'm not a fly-in, fly-out activist. My concerns about fracking aren't based on anxiety. I'm qualified and practiced as a scientist in the area of natural resource management. And these companies you seem to be handing fracking to on a silver platter are fly-in, fly-out, profit-driven environmental vandals and criminals, as keeps being presented. At the last hearing, I discussed a bit about ecological sustainable development and reflected on ESD history in the Northern Territory and gave the opinion that this has not been enforced on a number of occasions where maybe it should have been or ever been enforced. And there seems to be no stop on development, no matter what the risks, certain or uncertain. The Territory has become an environmental crime scene, and I think if the stop button's going to be pressed, it needs to be now with hydraulic fracturing. I'll just go to the next slide. In the last meeting, am I pointing this in a particular direction?
Got it now.
Right.
There you go.
Okay. So at the last hearing, I also raised my concerns about this sentence in at the beginning of the report, which I feel just sort of sets the scene for the whole inquiry, really. I know that the inquiry sets out to look at what regulations can be used to mitigate risks. So this sentence sort of sets the scene and says, and sort of makes this assumption that if there's good regulations, there's less environmental problems. At the time of the hearing, I didn't follow that question up at the end of my presentation, but discussed it with you a bit more at the community forum, and it took a while. It's different logic, I suppose, and it was acknowledged what I was talking about. And as I was leaving, the community forum, Justice Pepper came up to me quietly and said that they probably wouldn't be changing that sentence. It's an interesting sentence, and I'll go back to that a bit later on. Next one. So just in terms of my comments about the inquiry seeming to be handing fracking to the Northern Territory government and industry on a silver platter, even the oil industry has commented on that themselves, saying that this is just the interim report phase that's been qualified positive for Falcon and Origin. Major recommendations consist with other Australian and international reviews is that the environmental risks associated with hydraulic fracturing can be managed effectively subject to creation of robust regulatory regime. So again, set on that premise that regulations mitigate risks. And it's just, I'm not meaning to highlight this sentence more, it didn't fit on the other slide. Indeed, the inquiry actually said there were risks that groundwater or surface water could be contaminated by chemicals, but this could be contained by existing management strategies. Anyway, we'll get on to sort of more of the nitty-gritty, I suppose. Not as nitty-gritty as Naomi from Lock the Gate. So I'll start with your recommendations on a very important matter, climate change, and justifications for these. It's referenced quite a bit in this section. Scone et al. Life cycles analysis of natural gas extraction and power generation. It's the report makes a statement that new technology and best practices have been able to reduce emissions to quite a more acceptable level, and it seems this evidence has been used to go forth with the premise that it can be mitigated through best practices and new technologies. The report, this Scone et al. Is actually produced by the National Energy Technology Laboratory, which, is hardly an independent source. So it says, the model scenario produced emissions of 3% lower than historical practices. But also in that reference, it says that those technologies have not been achieved broad commercialisation. So I just feel that's not really a strong point. It's not a strong reference. And again, just shows me that there's so much other evidence out there, and why hasn't the world caught up with this great news? Whereas, since then, still scientists are saying that this is from an article, shale gas is one of the least sustainable ways to produce electricity. Saying how high the emissions are, even though shale gas has high emissions, it also has the lowest employment rate. So it just feels like sometimes in this draft final report there's a filtering of information to paint that nice picture that all these risks can be mitigated. The World Bank has said to end financial support for oil and gas extraction because of the impacts on climate change. Oops. And basically your recommendations don't really address the impact on climate change or make any comment about that, whether it's sustainable or not. It just goes into, we're just going to monitor, and then introduce world best practices, whatever they are, which haven't been commercially produced. There's further studies around too, you don't have to look far, that show that at best you could reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to CSG levels. And this particular report here actually comments on that, the Scone et al. Findings and the US EPA statements about reducing emissions, and says that they're a little bit short-sighted. EPA subsequently reduced the estimates for upstream emissions, cutting them approximately in half, relying on non-peer-reviewed industry report. And then, of course, just yesterday you were presented some very different views on greenhouse gas emissions. So I just, feel this is an example that I see throughout the report of just, you've set the scene from the start that we can mitigate all of this, and then just finding that evidence to prove it and not really interrogating that information and looking at what's happening worldwide or mainstream or peer reviewed. So that's just one example of climate change. Just down the road, you've got Elon Musk, Tesla in South Australia, putting solar, making deals and putting solar everywhere, and we're talking about this fracking. So I know I've been searching through the report, and my time's very limited. I'm not getting paid to assess this, it goes on about these world best regulations a lot. You've decided to consult with Alberta energy regulator and British Columbia as well, and neither of them have actually started doing shale gas on a commercial level. Is that right? No. This is taken directly from Alberta Energy's website, saying that it has extensive experience in development energy source. It has started shale gas, but it hasn't created specific regulation for shale gas. It's still using CSG regulations. And just getting back to that sentence, I suppose, and in the report it says that regulatory reform is considered by the panel to be a mitigating factor rather than a risk requiring assessment. So going back to that sentence from the start, I can't find the evidence or the report that's looked at fracking all over the world in different jurisdictions with different regulatory systems and come to a conclusion that there's modern ways to regulate this that are better and have less problems, which is the basis of this whole, or sets the scene for this whole inquiry. Currently, there are no statutes specifically tailored for shale gas operations. Okay, another one. Let's get towards. So that same oil industry report said that even though the fracking inquiry's not making a decision about fracking in the territory, Mr. Gunner has said that when the decision is made, it will take only by the Cabinet and Government and solely on recommendations of the Pepper inquiry. There is a responsibility in this inquiry to the end result as well. So I suppose just maybe a couple of questions as well. In relation to the new technologies and practices to reduce greenhouse emissions, can anyone on the panel elaborate on that? Maybe you, Dr. Vaughan Beck, and why isn't regulation considered a risk? That's probably my two main questions.
Sorry, this is your opportunity to present to us.
Yeah, okay. So I can't ask questions.
Well, again, if you just finish your presentation,
sorry.
please.
So I'll just finish and then probably just want to ask because I couldn't find it in the report.
So if there's something you can't find, then tell us and we can perhaps comment on that. I think that's probably the way to deal with it.
Okay, no worries. So just in relation to the new technologies and practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, can anyone elaborate on?
So hang on a second, just for this to work. So your comment is that you couldn't find in the report specification of those new technologies. Is that what your criticism is?
There was a little bit of stuff, but just if there's any further comment on that. From what I see, it's not being used commercially yet. Have you seen evidence of that? It did state some technical things have been implemented, but not really where it's been practiced and
So you're, again, if I can perhaps rephrase it, that you would like to see more specificity in relation to what those new technologies
whether
are.
they're ready to be adopted and commercially.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
how they
we
meet
will
and, yeah.
take that on board. Thank you. Anything further?
No.
Okay. Any questions?
Was there any more comments, sorry, about, I suppose, this whole premise that, and, you know, where are you getting your evidence that regulations can mitigate risks? A big question. I don't see that presented, it's just assumed from the start. I don't know if I'm missing something. Is there something in the background studies or terms of reference, or but I don't see. I think to make that conclusion you'd need to do a bit of research and analysis.
Might I make a comment on that?
Again, this is your opportunity to present to us.
Yes, yes.
I understand
Well,
that
that's my
submission,
concern.
and that's
It's
a
just my
submission.
concern that it's
Hang on a second,
assumption
please let me
stuff,
finish. Please let me finish.
Yeah.
That's your very powerful submission. I think it's your, if I understand your presentation correctly, it's your principal submission that regulation isn't the answer, as you say, we've said in the draft final report. I've understood that submission correctly?
Yeah, I think it's just an assumption. Like, you know, other people say there's still uncertainty around controlling these risks, but this inquiry is saying there is an uncertainty around controlling these risks. So therefore, we'll continue on now, and we'll write a report about how we can regulate it. So, yeah, I just feel like, the inquiry is not really, I think it's selling short the risks and using smoke and mirrors, basically, with all these regulatory recommendations to cover up the risks. I just don't see the evidence to set that premise.
I understand that submission. And I suppose, and to the extent that you would like to ask more detailed questions of the panel, just a reminder that we will be starting this week our community forums.
Can't make it.
And they will be, of course, in Humpty Doo and Darwin. Humpty Doo on the Friday evening, and then Darwin on the Saturday morning.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, Dr. Jones had a comment or a question.
Just in terms of evidence about the effectiveness of regulation, there is actually a body of published work which has looked at the improvements in regulation through time, and actually there's been a distinct correlation with a marked decrease in the number of reportable incidents as a result of that increased regulation. So there is actually an evidentiary base for saying that improved regulation actually has led to improved performance.
And what's
might be not be 100% performance, but it has certainly reduced the number of incidents that are occurring.
Okay. Great.
Anything?
And where can I find that, sorry? Sorry, go on.
Again, I'll leave you to do your own researches, but I think Dr. Beck has a question.
Yes, in terms of greenhouse gases, just let me observe that in the report there is, within the report there is a description of what new regulations have been implemented in the United States. There is a description of those regulations, and as a result of those implementation of those regulations, the emissions in the United States have dropped. So there's been a marked relationship between introduction of regulations and changes in emissions.
But, you know, they haven't reduced it to remarkably or reduced them completely. Then it's still an issue. It's still a climate change issue. Still producing greenhouse gases at CSG levels, according to some people, at best.
As I said, they've reduced them.
Yeah.
They haven't eliminated them, and in most activities, not all, it's very difficult to eliminate risk to zero. So there's always some residual. what we've done is indicate a raft of activities, not only in greenhouse gases but in other areas as well, that are recommendations for implementation that will reduce the level of risk to something that is either low or acceptable. And in greenhouse gases, the assessed risk was medium, and then with mitigation it was deemed to be acceptable, and a raft of recommendations are prescribed in the report, in the draft final report.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming today and your presentation. One final question. What's the date on, the article says January 23rd. What's the date on the article? Have you given us a link to the entire article? The reason I ask is we have made recommendation
I can tell you probably here.
in relation to whistleblower
the
protection.
24th of the 1st, 2017.
2000 of this year, so we can find it this year.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No,
All right,
last
thank you
year.
very much.
17 last year.
Sorry, last year, sorry. So what happens when you do an inquiry? It's, you lose sense of time. Thank you very much for coming today, and we'll
No.
chase that article down. We will have a very short break now,